Hello, everybody, and welcome to another edition of Wordfence Live. Today is September 8th, 2020. Thanks to everybody who got here early. I saw we were over 300 people hanging out in the chat, talking to Tim Cantrell. He's our lead customer service engineer, answering some questions there. So we appreciate everybody being here early and hanging out, getting ready for us to go live. So right now, my name is Scott Miller. I'm a support engineer here at Wordfence as well. In a few moments, I'm going to be joined by QA engineer and threat analyst Ram Gall, as well as threat analyst Chloe Chamberlain. You've probably seen their names a lot if you are subscribed to our mailing list. They've been finding a lot of things in plugins and getting blog posts and firewall rules and signatures out there. So today we're going to be talking about that. We're going to be talking about plugins, how to choose the right plugin for your site, the right plugin depending on what you need, and how to evaluate plugins based on security and going through things to best get where you need to be with your site. WordPress is a very customizable option, and that's one of the things that makes it awesome. There's over 57,000 plugins in a repository, and it's important to know how to choose the right plugin for the job. So that's what we're going to go over today. And building off where we started last week with the 3 worst hacks that we've ever seen at Wordfence. And if you haven't seen that video, definitely go over and check that out. That's going to be on our Wordfence channel here. And you can learn from those mistakes, those stories. Those were 3 different instances that we saw here at Wordfence, and they led to site cleanings that were pretty severe. So we had 3 of those stories last week. And this week, we're going to be adding on with another 3 to help you learn from those as well. Those are things that all of us can learn from. So you're going to want to be here for that when we go over that towards the end of the stream. I see we got a lot of people in chat here. Let us know where you're watching from. I'm streaming from the Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania area. And it's another nice day here. We've been very lucky with the weather. I see Philadelphia, PA. The snowy Colorado, we have a couple people in Colorado as well, so crazy weather there. We got England and Maryland. Thanks to all of you for hanging out with us and tuning in. I see some familiar names as well, so let us know in chat if you've been here for multiple times, if this isn't your first time here on Wordfence Live. We've had a bunch of these, probably over 4 months now that we've been doing this. So if there's anything that you're interested in with regards to security or Wordfence as far as features, we probably have videos of it on our YouTube channel. So you can head over and check that out after this stream. Some of our earlier videos, we go over setting up different features in Wordfence, such as brute force protection, rate limiting. We go over our premium features and country blocking. So those are some things that you can check out and really set them up to protect your site based on what kind of site you have. A few weeks ago, we went over different e-commerce security standards and how to be PCI DSS compliant. So that's another thing to check out. We have multiple videos that show vulnerabilities and how a compromise can happen from start to finish. And these are things that we've protected against and that we currently protect against, and just showing you how those can be carried out. So those are really cool to see. And Chloe and Ram both do those here on Wordfence Live with us. So some definitely some cool videos to check out there. So if you're excited for today's stream, hit the like button below and in YouTube, and we'll be sure to make more similar content going forward. You can also subscribe and hit the bell on YouTube, and you'll be notified whenever we go live. Typically, we go live every Tuesday at noon Eastern Time, 9 a.m. Pacific. Now, so as you know, talking about plugins, lots and lots of plugins. It's constantly growing, and the same goes with WordPress itself. WordPress is now powering over 30% of the web. As I said earlier, very customizable. You can really find and create your vision with WordPress. But the problem is that it's a big target for hackers and bots. And we have an incredibly powerful security plugin for that with Wordfence, and it comes both in a free and premium version. So we're protecting well over 3 million sites right now with the free and premium version. And here in a little while, I'm going to go over some of the premium features that really makes it as powerful as it is. But if you're just new to this, if you're new to Wordfence, you're just starting a WordPress site, potentially, you're not sure what security solution to use, there are a lot of great free features in Wordfence. So you can try it out there and see if it works well with your site. That's one of the good things about having as many plugins as you do with WordPress. There are a lot of options, and that's what we're going to do today. We're going to help you figure out what options and how to select a plugin for your site. So as I said earlier, would love to hear if you've been using Wordfence for a while, or maybe you've been using Wordfence Premium. I see there's some premium mentions in the chat. So let us know if you've been using premium, or potentially how many sites you're using it on. Also, let us know the same for Wordfence Central. And if you're not familiar with Wordfence Central is a central place on wordfence.com where you can set up all your sites that you protect with Wordfence, whether they're free or premium, and it's a free service as well. So head over to wordfence.com/central and check that out there. You can add all your sites, you can configure them with templates, and really you're just monitoring the security of all of your sites from one central location. So it's a very, very powerful free tool. So we are broadcasting to YouTube here, and these are public comments. So we ask that you don't share anything private or sensitive, and instead, if you have anything directly related to your site that you might need to talk about, if your site might be compromised, anything specific or sensitive, you can send that into feedback@wordfence.com. And you can write in any questions you have there. Use the subject line Wordfence Live, and we'll get back to you quickly there. So we're going to be talking today about choosing the right plugin for your job. We're going to go over the basics as well, how do plugins work, what are plugins, what can they do, and the differences between plugins and themes. So we're going to be reviewing also some resources that help you evaluate a plugin's safety and effectiveness, which is very important when choosing a plugin. Before we jump into that, I mentioned we were going to have Chloe and Ram with us. So let's bring in threat analyst Chloe Chamberlain. How's it going, Chloe?
Good. How are you doing today?
Good. Now, how's the weather up there? You're not in Florida anymore, are you?
Nope, not in Florida anymore. I'm up in Maine, and the weather here is beautiful. It's actually a little bit hotter today, so I guess that's nice for a day or
It,
two.
it looks really nice out there. Yeah, it's not quite as sunny right here right now, but we've had our fair share, so I guess I can't complain. No, you're not missing Florida too much right now, are you? It's got to be pretty beautiful up there.
Not at all. Yeah, it's just so nice being out in nature with the cooler weather. And Florida, it's like you step outside for 5 seconds and you're done.
Now, you write a lot about plugins, and you're looking at plugins a majority. Would you say that you're looking at plugins a majority of your day in general, or are you kind of just browsing through, looking for different issues? So that brings me to the file manager issue. You reported on that last week. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct.
And what did you find there? Just a brief little overview.
Yeah, so someone wrote into us letting us know that there was a vulnerability in the file manager plugin. And so Ram and I, this was last Tuesday, right before office hours. Ram and I had a look at the plugin. The Gonzalo Cruz, who reported it to us, did provide us with a POC, which made our lives a little bit easier because we didn't have to figure out what exactly was happening. But we used that POC to confirm the vulnerability, and then we kind of looked at the code to figure out what exactly happened. And basically there was a file on there that was, I think, meant for like testing purposes or used if you secured it the proper way, but it wasn't secured in the proper way or anything. So it allowed for arbitrary files to be uploaded to a directory that wasn't even inside the uploads directory. So certain hardening things might have been less effective in this situation. But yeah, essentially it allowed file uploads, so like PHP files that contain backdoors and things. So it was a pretty bad vulnerability, and it was already being widely exploited. I think before we even analyzed it, there was like something like 300,000 blocked attempts by our firewall. It was pretty crazy.
Wow.
It's been growing,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, that doesn't sound like a good vulnerability to run into. And I believe Ram's going to give us just a little bit of an update here when we bring him in here in a moment. Before we do that, now on a normal week, we talked about, you're looking at plugins a lot. What, as a threat analyst, which you've been doing for a little while now, are there times where you are not going off tips? You had mentioned somebody had mentioned this issue specifically to us, and that allowed you to go over and really take an in-depth look. Now, if somebody doesn't give a tip, what sort of methods are you using to find these issues in plugins?
Yeah, so I use the WP directory, which is a searching engine to search like all the files, and content and stuff of plugins. And I'll look for some of the most common issues. So like I'll look for Ajax actions, and then I'll go through and see if any of those plugins have like unprotected Ajax actions, file upload functions, and just certain things that could have potential to be vulnerable. So I basically search for those, and then once I find something that looks like it could have an issue, I take that plugin, I install it on my testing site, and then I'll take a closer look at the functionality of the plugin, the code, and everything, and then go from there if there's any vulnerabilities and write things up and get firewall rules ready. And yeah, that's the process.
Those firewall rules, for anybody who aren't sure, those, if you're a premium subscriber, a lot of the times you're getting those immediately whenever Chloe and Ram and the rest of the threat intel team find these issues. They get a new rollout, sometimes the same day or within a day or so of finding these issues, and that protects a lot of sites. So what Chloe's doing is keeping a lot of people safe here online. So we talked about QA engineer, threat analyst Ram Gall. Let's bring Ram Gall in here.
Hi.
Hi, Ram. No flashlight this week. So anybody who missed it last week, we went over some horror stories, and that was a fun time. So we're going to build off that today. But before we get into our plugins and whatnot, I asked Chloe about the file manager plugin. Is there any update there, or do you have something in the works that we're not ready to share?
Well, I did mention on Friday, this past Friday, that over 1 million individual sites had been attacked just that day, looking, or at least probed for that vulnerability just that day. As of today, we've tracked 2.5 million sites that have been probed for this vulnerability total. So we do have some more information in the works about what the attackers are, the primary threat actors are possibly trying to do with this attack. I can't tell you too much more than that at the moment, but this is not the end of that story. We'll have more information for you guys, so make sure to subscribe.
Yeah, that's a good place to leave subscribing to the mailing list, because if you're not currently subscribed to the mailing list, you might hear of a new vulnerability or some major security news from that mailing list. So whether you're a free or premium user, definitely check out the mailing list there and be subscribed. We don't send a bunch of stuff out, so you're not going to get overwhelmed with alerts there. Although, over the past few months, I guess you two have been involved in a lot of findings, so maybe we are sending quite a few things out. So that's definitely a good thing to be alerted of there. So I asked Chloe, how she normally looks through different plugins. Is your approach pretty similar, Ram? Because you do spend a lot of time doing QA as well. So are you split 50-50 between that, or are you doing more QA typically?
It really depends on the week. When I do actually search for vulnerabilities, sometimes I do it the same way that Chloe does, but a lot of the time when I find a vulnerability, it's because a vulnerability has just been patched in a plugin. And then I look through the code trying to figure out how it worked, so I can write a firewall rule or test a firewall rule that Chloe wrote. And then I'll find another vulnerability. So yeah, it's at least half of the vulnerabilities I find are because someone patched an existing vulnerability but didn't actually go through their plugin code to make sure that there weren't any more.
Okay, that's interesting. So you're pretty much now. Does it matter to you whenever you're looking for that? If somebody had just patched a large vulnerability, if you see a large security issue get patched, is that where you're going first?
I mean, the safety of our customers is our number one priority. So before I even really start hunting too much, our first priority is taking a look at the large vulnerability, making sure that we have a firewall rule for it, if it's one we didn't discover ourselves. And then I will track down any additional vulnerabilities. If they are larger than the one that got initially disclosed, then that's the one we'll prioritize. If it has a higher severity. But we'll usually try and get both out within 24 hours of finding out about it.
We have a comment in chat saying that you're being modest, Ram, and I agree. Ram is always modest, as is Chloe. Those two are always keeping Wordfence safe and the other plugins by finding this issues. Okay, so Ram, what are we going into first here? I know we're looking at plugins. We're going to be going over the basics and showing you pretty much what to look for in a plugin. But let's start very basic here. What exactly is a plugin for anybody who's new?
Well, a plugin is basically a way to make your WordPress site be more than a blog where you can add posts and pages. It adds additional functionality, contact forms, search engine optimization, security, e-commerce functionality. Basically, it's a way to make your website do something other than whatever WordPress does on its own. I mean, there's it lives in the WP content plugins directory by default. And it'll include stuff like PHP files to actually add functionalities, CSS style sheets to add appearance changes, JavaScript files to add more functionality. And it's basically a separate program that runs and makes use of WordPress. I think Chloe might actually have a slightly better explanation than I do, but
No, that's a good explanation. So basically, when you click install plugin on your site, it's basically taking a zip file of that plugin from the WordPress repository and taking it to your site, unpacking it, and then making that neat little plugin directory for that plugin. And that's where all the functionality is stored. And yeah, I think that's a pretty good explanation of a plugin.
Now, whenever, I'm not sure how long both of you have been using WordPress, but early on with WordPress, there weren't, a lot of plugins. And look where we are now. Is it over 50,000, I believe? So
that's over 9,000.
That is over 9,000, a little bit. That's a lot of plugins for you two to search in, and the rest of the threat intel team. So, what were some of the common early plugins that we would see with WordPress?
Hello Dolly was one of them. I think that was just one to show the functionality of plugins. And then Akismet was one of the first ones, I believe. So that was there for spam protection to help make sure that your comments don't get overwhelmed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that can help. And Akismet is still around, right? For spam protection and that's a go-to for spam, I would say.
Yes. We're always saying that, spam is one of the things, at least as far as comments, that Wordfence doesn't specialize in addressing. And that's because there's already a really good solution for it. Now, if someone actually gets on your site and adds spam to like your actual file system, then we'll catch it and help you get rid of it. But as far as like comment spam, there's already a great solution for that.
Yeah. If you have comments enabled, and you have to have comments enabled, that's pretty much a go-to plugin. So, building off of that, what plugins are and some examples. Now, with 57,000 plus plugins at the current time, what kind of plugins are out there now? What are the most common things that we're seeing on sites?
I think I might have covered this a bit. Contact forms are very common. Search engine optimization is pretty common. E-commerce, and WooCommerce is the big e-commerce plugin in the WordPress ecosystem. But there are literally hundreds or thousands of plugins that are just designed to add functionality to WooCommerce the same way plugins add functionality to WordPress in the first place. And of course, security is important. I'd like to think that at least. Yeah.
As they say, there's a plugin for that.
Exactly. Oh, and so there's also a weird sort of middle ground between plugins and themes, where like there'll be plugins that add like extra like site, like what you see is what you get building functionality, but sometimes that'll also show up in themes like Divi, the one that Chloe found a bunch of vulnerabilities. Actually, Chloe's found a bunch of vulnerabilities in several of these recently. So yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot out there, and you know, WordPress is constantly, seemingly trying to integrate more into it, maybe to reduce the number of plugins you need to have. Is that something that you saw commonly, Chloe, whenever you were doing site cleanings, that sometimes there's just too many plugins, and that there's some small things that plugins do that were being used that might have been unnecessary? I know sometimes in support, I'll be looking at somebody's site and we'll see, you know, there's like 60 plugins, and, you know, a lot of them might be deactivated, and some of them functionality wise, they just don't do much. Is that something that you would run into?
Yeah, I think that's really common with WordPress too, because it's easy to like install a plugin and just kind of forget about it in the background, and it just kind of sits there. I think there was several cases where there was just a bunch of plugins installed, and I hear about it all the time where there's like, I see like sometimes on Twitter, someone will be like, I just looked at a client site and there was like 100 plugins, and it's like, oh my goodness, you don't need 100 plugins. But yeah, I think it's easy to forget about them, but it's really important that you don't, because, for example, if you left the file manager plugin on your site, you had used it once, maybe a year ago, but you just left it there because you were finished using it. I was actually a victim of that. I had it installed on my site. Thankfully, I had Wordfence installed to protect my site, but it's easy to leave a plugin and forget about it. And then a year later, a vulnerability is discovered and you totally forgot about the plugin that was there. So it's really important to remove those ones that you're not using. And yeah.
I will say this, as far as plugins that only do a few things very simply, in a lot of the cases, those are actually safer, depending on what few things they're doing and how they do them. If for plugins that have like really simple functionality, it's usually pretty easy to find any vulnerabilities. And if the plugin developer is actually responsive and patches when problems are disclosed, then they're usually pretty secure. Whereas plugins that add like a lot of, you know, big complex functionality, a lot of the times those will keep on having emerging issues just because it's a much bigger attack surface. So
I see some people in chat listing how many plugins they're using, and whenever I mentioned earlier, you know, a bunch of plugins, it still does depend, you know, what we're going over today, making sure that you're responsibly choosing plugins, keeping plugins up to date, using security, you know. So somebody had mentioned they're using 60 and they're using all of them, and somebody asked if 20 plugins for a site is too many, and that doesn't seem like too many if you're using them and they're being updated regularly and you're keeping.
If you know what they all do.
Yeah, and if you're using all of them, yeah.
Yeah, that's fine. It's not that, you know, more plugins is necessarily bad. It's more that more plugins is more plugins to keep track of.
More overhead.
Yeah. So.
No, we see a lot of differences as far as plugins and support whenever people write in with free and premium plugins, which Wordfence has as well. Can you talk a little bit about that, Ram, some of the common types of plugins?
Yes. So most of the plugins that you'll see, or actually all the plugins that you'll see in the WordPress.org repository, which is the thing that gets searched when you just try to add a plugin using the search function inside your WordPress site, those are open source. They're free. They're built on the GPL license, which is a requirement for WordPress.org. That means that anyone can effectively copy and modify and redistribute that code, which does have some potentially problematic implications, which we'll get to later when it comes to nulled plugins. But the ones that are actually like legitimate, they will be on the WordPress.org, which does have standards for its plugins. Then there's freemium functionality, which Wordfence, we use the freemium functionality. Yoast has that most of the really large plugins also operate this way. It's effectively you get some degree of functionality for free, but then you purchase a license key, and there's some other functionality that gets unlocked. In most cases, it's distributed as software as a service. So, like for us, you get our real-time IP blacklist. You get our firewall rules and malware signatures immediately. That's effectively a software as a service functionality. For other plugins like Akismet, it's so that they can analyze comments using their super advanced technology to determine whether or not they're spam. And yeah, that's probably one of the better monetization models, because the code's still open source. It can still be examined by security researchers, and bugs can be found. The third most common type of plugin is premium or commercial plugins, where you can buy them from places like Code Canyon or Theme Forest, or on rare occasions, the actual plugin developer's site itself. These are usually subject to less scrutiny because the code is only available for when you purchase it. So they don't receive as much security review, but still, if you purchase it from a reputable vendor and they are a vendor that actually updates when the vulnerabilities are found, these are still relatively safe. It's just that they don't get as much security review. But that also means that if attackers are hunting for vulnerabilities, they might also not be willing to spring the $50 or $60 for the premium copy of the plugin, unless they've hacked a site through some other means and gotten a copy that way, which they most assuredly can. And that brings us to our fourth type of plugin, which is nulled plugins, which you should never ever install. So basically, nulled plugins are pirated copies of plugins with premium functionality, and they always include some kind of malware or backdoor functionality, which the owner of the nulled site, sometimes it'll even be in their terms of service that, hey, we can connect to your site at any time and change anything we want to, and you accept this by downloading the nulled plugin. And usually they use it to either advertise themselves or do some black hat SEO, selling backlinks to other sites or pharma spam, or anything they want to with your site. Basically, if you download an old plugin, you're handing over the keys to your site to whoever's site you downloaded it from.
Yeah, it doesn't sound like too many good things come from that. It's not worth the money that you think you're saving, because eventually down the line you're probably going to have the site cleaned, or worse, start over from scratch. So yeah, that's never good. Now, Chloe, you work with plugins regularly. What are the differences between plugins and extensions?
Yeah, so a plugin is basically something that added to your WordPress site, whereas an extension is more like added to the plugin. So your plugins can have extensions on top of the plugin just to provide more functionality within the plugin. And it's not going to be like an extension to your site, but an extension to the plugin.
It's just plugins all the way down.
Yeah, extension. Yeah.
And can you two talk about why we need to evaluate plugins? This is what we talked about earlier, with the importance. If you have a bunch of plugins on your site, you need to take a good look at what's happening with those plugins, know what they're doing, and remove what you don't use in general. And that's something we've talked about in previous weeks. With something like a file manager plugin, that should be something that you would install when you need it and then remove. So what are some other reasons that we need to evaluate plugins?
So when you install a plugin on your site, you're installing a bunch of code that's written by a developer. There's several different developers out there. Lots, actually. Probably almost all the plugins are written by different developers. And so when you're installing that onto your site, you're installing more code onto your site, which makes a larger attack surface. So every time you install a plugin on your site, you're increasing the attack surface of your site. So you need to make sure that when you're installing that code on your site, it's not going to do harm to your site, but there's certain ways you can look at it and try and determine if that's going to happen. But yeah, so there's just so many different plugins being offered by so many different people. And it's very important that you take the time to take a look at those to make sure that you're not introducing vulnerabilities onto your site. And if you don't need the plugin, you don't need the plugin, then it's better not to have it on your site, because again, it's less of an attack surface for attackers, and less likely that you'll have a vulnerability on your site if you have a lot less plugins than, say, someone else. Ram, does that sound about right?
Yeah, that honestly, yeah, you covered pretty much all of it. I guess the only thing I want to add to that is that, if you're installing code on your website or your phone or your computer, you're basically saying that you implicitly trust the person who wrote that code to some extent. And it's a really good idea to find out what, as far how the person that wrote that code maintains that code, how they take responsibility for that code. I've mentioned this before, but I would much rather install a plugin that has had vulnerabilities found and addressed immediately than a plugin that has never had any detected vulnerabilities.
For sure.
Though a plugin that keeps on having vulnerabilities found, especially if they don't react to them very quickly, that might be more of a problem.
Yeah, I think looking at the disclosure timelines for those vulnerabilities is really important, because if a developer takes 2 months to patch a simple vulnerability, whereas another plugin takes a day, I mean, wouldn't you want to go with the one that took a day?
That tells you where their priorities for. Like if you're a plugin developer and you release this thing out into the world, it becomes your responsibility to some extent. And if there's a vulnerability in it, then either making sure that that vulnerability is addressed or that the plugin is no longer available is also your responsibility. Yeah. So, and I mean, if a plugin vulnerability leads to a hack, we've talked about, plugin developer responsibility, but your customers aren't going to blame the plugin developer. They're going to blame you for installing that plugin if their data is stolen, and it is your website. So.
Now, before we move on to our next section here, I see we have a question. Do we advise activating or deactivating automatic updates? And that's something we've covered extensively a few weeks ago, and we have a good blog post out on that. And what we did with those in Wordfence Live and in the blog post, we sort of went over each different kind of website you might be running. Maybe it's a small blog that you rarely log on to. You might want to use automatic updates at that point, or maybe you have an e-commerce site where you have a whole team dedicated to looking at security, and in those cases you might not enable it. Anything to add, to something like that? We have some resources available with Wordfence Live and our blog post. That might have been around August 11th. For whoever asked that question, you can check out for that. But anything to add to that, Chloe or Ram?
I feel like, honestly, it's not something that we can cover in the amount of time we have. I really recommend reading the blog post, because it just depends on who you are and what your risk profile is and how you interact with your site. So, I do see we had another question a while going a little further back, and that was, how does 2.5 million attacks against the file manager compare to other attacks? And the truth is, that's huge. For a single vulnerability or over a short period of time, bear in mind, that's just 2.5 million sites that we're protecting, that we're seeing attacked. And that is, Wordfence is installed on over 3 million sites, but that's still a huge portion of our customer base. And Wordfence is not, we're very popular, but we're not installed on every site. So that's just the attacks that we're able to see. There's plenty of other sites out there that are likely being attacked that Wordfence is not installed on. So yes, 2.5 million sites that we're seeing attacked probably translates to a lot more sites that we're not seeing attacked.
I see we have another question, pretty general. What sort of plugins should we avoid? That's difficult as well. You're going to want to avoid, as Ram said, nulled plugins for sure. Then you're going to want to look also, when were these plugins that you're looking at, when was it last updated? If it's abandoned, that's another thing. Check your plugins section. Wordfence will alert you if you have abandoned plugins. So it's always good to take a moment to try to look for an alternative there, and you're looking for something that's, maybe supported well and updated frequently as well.
I want to add to that, and we will get a little bit more into other categories of plugins to avoid, but specifically, I do recommend avoiding any premium paid plugins, like where you have to pay to download a copy, that use code obfuscation, where they make the code unreadable. It does protect their intellectual property, but a lot of the time they'll use these same obfuscation techniques as malware authors, and it makes it harder or impossible to determine what the code is actually doing, which makes it a lot less trustable. Also, it makes it harder or impossible to determine any vulnerabilities that are present in that code, which also makes it less trustworthy. So
That's good
I do
advice.
recommend staying away from obfuscated plugins, not to mention that many of the obfuscation techniques will trigger not only R, but many other security solutions, virus scanners. So you'll also be inundated with maybe, but not definitely false positives, regardless of who you use to scan your site.
And okay, so building off where we were last week, we talked about 3 cool stories that resulted in major issues for different clients, and these were related to some site cleanings that we had done, and just some major horror stories for sites that were a result to different hacks. And we got a couple more of those. So Ram, do you want to kick us off with those?
Yes, I will. Pipdig, a premium paid theme developer, creates a plugin that allowed them total access to the sites it was installed on. Anyways, you may have heard this, but Pipdig is a UK-based plugin and theme developer. And one of our users found some strange code in their companion plugin, which is called Pipdig Power Pack, or P3, that was obfuscated. Yeah, that's kind of a theme, with misleading variable names, function names, and comments to hide what the plugin was actually intended for. And again, they baked in malicious actions that could grant themselves administrative access to any site running their plugin, or even completely remove their customers' site databases, which, if you're familiar with how WordPress works, the database is where all of your posts are actually stored, all of your content, all of your settings. If you delete a site's database but leave everything else, you've deleted the site far more thoroughly than if you just deleted all the files. And I think they did some other stuff with that, right, Chloe? What did they actually use it for?
Yeah, I think they were also DDoSing their competitors using the files.
Now, can you elaborate on what a DDoS attack is?
Yeah. So DDoS is distributed denial of service attack. So basically, it's going to essentially a bunch of, I guess I would call them bots or zombies or whatever you want to call them, computers, sending requests to a site to try and take it offline. It's compromising the availability core of the CIA triad, if you want to look that up. But so it's basically sending a bunch of requests to a site, and it's all coming from different IP addresses. So basically, these sites were all the different IP addresses going to one site to try and take it offline. Those are really hard to mitigate just because of the fact that they're coming from several different IP addresses. But yeah, that's the core of it, is it's sending a bunch of requests to try and take a site offline using different IP addresses so that it is harder to protect yourself against.
So they literally use their own customers to literally take down another competitor's site, and their customers got the blame for it and ended up on like block lists and stuff, which is just horrifying, right?
It's crazy.
And it's a really good thing that we had a user report this to us, and so we did an in-depth analysis of the plugin, and Pipdig tried to cover their tracks and pushed some undocumented updates to their plugins to remove the malicious code, and even changed the dates on their changelog entries. And now, don't get me wrong, we do on occasion even see this with plugins that just have vulnerabilities, where they'll try to erase the fact that a vulnerable version ever existed. But Pipdig really went all out on it. They even took down the entire Bitbucket repository they used as like their basically their repository to track code changes. So yeah, they tried real hard to cover the tracks, but not before we could find some evidence. And pretty much most of the WordPress developer community is watching at this point. And there were hundreds of fashion bloggers who had no idea that their sites were backdoored and being used by this plugin developer to attack the plugin developer's competitor. But anyways, they did end up somewhat shunned by most of the WordPress community at large, though they are still in business. So I don't want to say that the story has a happy ending, but as I understand it, they're not nearly as respected or used as they used to be.
Could you imagine finding out that your site was sending requests in the background and you had no idea, trying to take another site offline?
Yes, I can.
Scary. That's scary.
Yeah. I think it's when you're looking at plugins, like just do a quick Google search of the plugin too, because I'm sure all the stories about this come up when you first search for it. So like if you're looking at installing a plugin, maybe do a quick Google search and see if anything crazy comes up.
Yeah, always. Yeah, seriously, just do some basic, like, searching for, like, if someone has had a major problem with the plugin and you just, do a Google search for that plugin, you'll find out a lot about what's going on with it.
Now, before we get into the second one, and we had a comment, Ram, that your horror movie voice is epic. That wasn't exactly what was said, but that's the gist I'm sending you. But before we get into the next one, Ram will try to do another good one. We have a question, and Chloe, I think you can grab this one. It was something that we had talked about a few times here. Somebody is asking, what is a Nulled plugin?
Yeah, so a Nulled plugin is basically a free plugin or theme offered on a variety of sites. Most of the time, I wouldn't say all the time though, it literally says like Nulled plugins. So it's pretty obvious. It's something that's not in the WordPress repository or on like ThemeForest or Code Canyon or one of those reputable areas. But the thing with the Nulled plugins is that they're free for premium plugins. Yay, great. But a lot of times, most of the time, those have malware in them to infect your site once you install them. And I think Ram has done a little bit of research on this. I don't know if he wants to share a little bit more or have any other.
They be pirated plugins.
What was that, Ram?
They be pirated plugins.
Yeah.
Like, that you wouldn't download a car thing? Like, well, I mean, yes, I might actually download a car, but I wouldn't download a car if the car had a bomb in it.
There you go. Yeah. So, in general, you're only going to bring issues upon yourself and your site if you're turning to these Nulled themes, and you're going to spot them either by them being, it's not always just looking for a free version of, like $100 plugin or a theme. It could, be presented as a heavy discount on a theme or a plugin as well, and that should be a flag.
Usually those. So I do want to clarify that usually the ones that have the heavy discount are just basically they're selling a free copy of the plugin that doesn't actually add any functionality, whereas the Nulled ones, they sometimes try to add functionality, it just doesn't work very well, and so you're still not getting the full functionality.
Yeah, it just unfortunately leads to bad things. So that's definitely something to avoid. Now
we'll have a blog article about it coming out sometime the next week. So if you're curious.
Another reason to subscribe to the mailing list there. That will be a good read. Horror story number 2. What do we have, Ram?
Mason Soiza. In the fall of 2017, the Wordfence security services team discovered malware in a plugin that was installed from the repository on a site. The plugin Display Widgets was installed on over 200,000 WordPress sites. And Chloe, I'll let you take it from here since I've done the horror voice.
Yeah, I love your horror voice. But so essentially, Mason Soiza had bought several plugins, if I recall correctly, and was injecting malware spam into these plugins that were in the WordPress repository. Correct, Ram? Is that correct?
Yes.
Yeah.
It turns out that what he'd done was he'd actually purchased the rights and ownership of a number of plugins that were legitimate in the WordPress repository and added his own code, basically a way to add spam content. Remember what we were saying, how Nulled plugins are sometimes used to do that? For like Black Hat SEO. Well, Mason Soiza was adding spam content to sites running the plugin. And I guess he purchased like 9 of them. You already said that, didn't you? But yeah, anyways, it took like 4.5 years before all of these actually got caught, which is kind of surprising. And he's still at it, right? Just not like the WordPress plugins. He's gotten out of that biz, but he's still at some kind of scam, right?
Yeah. So like UK pets and meds and stuff. Yeah, it's still going.
So he's still doing pharma spammy stuff.
Yeah.
Fair enough. So, anyways,
do you know if they were like low user count plugins or were they high? Do we know?
I think most of them were low, but I think he managed to get a deal on the display widget one, which again had 200,000 installations. So
yeah. Cool.
So supply chain attacks are real and they can happen. I'm going to segue for a moment. Back when cryptocurrency was worth a lot, back in, I want to say 2018 or something, we'd still occasionally find remnants of, legitimate plugins where the developers would add code to crypto mine your site's visitors without you knowing it, and it would slow down your site and it would make them money. But that's against the WordPress repository's terms of service, so those pretty much all got pulled.
Yeah, that I remember when that happened initially in 2017, and that was quite crazy. That another horror story. I mean, yeah, you get Ram with a flashlight and around a campfire with his horror voice, and these are scary stories. What do you have for our third one, Ram?
The support tunnel. And this was a site cleaning that happened before my time and about 4 years ago. But apparently the site was significantly hacked, and we got it back on its feet. But we found out that a plugin basically added a remote access tunnel. It was a paid SEO plugin. So it doesn't look like it was actually intended for a malicious purpose. It was literally just so that the plugin developer could offer support. But it used a hard-coded password. So some hacker got into the site via some other means, which I mentioned before, discovered that there was a hard-coded password in this support functionality, and then was able to gain access to every other site running that plugin. So yeah, it was a paid plugin, so it wasn't in a repo, so it did take longer for security researchers to find out what was happening. If it was in the repo, we probably would have found it a lot sooner and gotten them to fix it before the attacker could have done too much damage. But yeah, even if you have the best of intentions, like things can go very wrong. Sorry, what was that?
I just said accidents happen.
Accidents do happen. I did not bring my flashlight. All I have is a laser pointer.
Oh man.
Next time. Last time we talked about the 3 stories. The common theme was compromised credentials. And this time our theme, we're just hoping that you take a good look at what you're downloading and what you're using on your site. And we've talked about these Nulled plugins.
Yeah, check the support forums and see how responsive the plugin developers are to support requests, because that will let you know that they probably do care about the customer experience.
Very true. Now, we got a little bit more left here for you, but before we get into that, I just want to say thanks, for everybody who hung out early with us, asked some questions. And I said earlier I would talk about some of our premium features for anybody who is not currently using Wordfence Premium. So one of the best features that we have, in my opinion, is the real-time IP blacklist. And this is a list of IPs that is monitored by us on our side. There's IPs that are added and removed by us if they're inactive or as they become more active. So this is a feature that whenever you add the Wordfence license to your site, it's automatically enabled, and you don't need to do anything for the feature. It blocks a large number of requests at times to your site, and rather than allowing those IPs to brute force your site or try to get in via a specific vulnerability or anything else, they are just blocked, and they're giving a low resource block page. So the real-time IP blacklist is an awesome premium feature that it's just there. It's, set it and forget it. It's one of those good ones. So if you're using premium, you can check out in your live traffic area to see how many blocks are being made. If you're getting alerts of high attack rates on your site, those may be related to the real-time IP blacklist, where you might see a couple hundred attempts in a very short span that get blocked there. So great feature. Another one, country blocking. This is something that you can use to block either access to your entire site or the login form only. And, on all my sites that I build, either for test purposes or just small personal hobby sites, I typically block the login form from all countries except for my own, and just the login form. And if there's a high attack rate from a specific country that I don't need to visit the site, of course you can throw that in there as well for a time, or add to them as you need to if you don't do business in certain areas. So another great feature that really cuts down on how much worrying you have to do on your site. And as we talked about earlier, Ram and Chloe putting out these new rules all the time. Those come to you immediately as a premium member rather than 30 days later, which you would get those as a free user. So lots and lots of good value there. And that's for $99 for one site. And the $99 license will also cover your staging site as well if you have one. Now, before we get into our next thing here, Ram, we had a question earlier that I wanted to ask you. Somebody had mentioned they stopped using Wordfence Central, I believe it was, because it needed too much bandwidth, or more bandwidth than they had. And they had asked if the requirement had been reduced.
So Central doesn't use too much bandwidth. We have made some changes to minimize the amount of memory, especially uses at one time. I know that's different from bandwidth, but the comment also mentioned memory usage, I think, so that it doesn't place as much load on the server at once. It doesn't communicate as frequently unless something actually happens on the site. Nonetheless, if you're running like 10 sites on a shared hosting account, that is really not recommended, because number one, if any one of those sites is compromised, they are all compromised. And not to mention that if you have any kind of traffic at all on more than one site at a time, that is going to, also affect your load. It's not going to be able to handle much traffic. So we don't recommend that setup, but we have made some changes to be a little bit nicer to the server.
Okay, thank you for that. Now, back into plugin talk. What are some tools that we see or we recommend for evaluating plugins? So somebody's just getting ready to start up their WordPress site. What should they be looking at here?
You can start with the WordPress.org repository. So you can take a look at the area there. It's going to tell you how many sites it's installed on. That's not going to be as important per se, but the thing is the higher count plugins are usually going to have more security researchers targeting those. So it's more likely that those get looked at a little more often than, say, one that has 5,000 installs versus one that has 5 million installs. You're probably going to see a little bit more activity from security researchers on those higher numbers. You want to check the reviews to see if there's any commonalities, how often, or is there any issues that they frequently see in the reviews, like at all 1-star reviews because something. And you also want to look at the support forum there. It's going to tell you, is there common issues again? How often are those resolved? Are they resolved quickly? Does it take them a lot of time to resolve support requests? That's a good indicator about how likely they might be to respond to a security vulnerability and getting that patched. Another thing that's important is to look at how often it's updated. Was it updated 5 years ago? If so, then that's considered an abandoned plugin, and you probably don't want to install it on your site because there's possibilities that there's vulnerabilities in there that wouldn't be patched as quickly because the developer hasn't touched it in 5 years. A good rule of thumb for updates, what would you guys say is a good rule of thumb for how often a plugin is updated?
I'd say 6 months, honestly. We usually 2 years is when it starts getting, extremely sketchy. But with new versions of WordPress coming out and possibly breaking compatibility, most plugin authors are going to have to update their plugins like every 6 months to make sure that it doesn't conflict with another plugin. And I mean, that is another thing where like the install count does tell you something, because plugins with a higher install count are more likely to respond quickly when there's a problem, are more likely to care if their plugin isn't compatible with other plugins or WordPress updates. So they're more likely to update frequently, more likely to respond if there's a security issue. That's not to say that bigger is always better, just that bigger will probably be fixed sooner.
Yeah.
So, and
Now,
also
any other tools for evaluating plugins?
Ram just mentioned that the changelog is also something you should definitely check in the WordPress repository area, because you can see where vulnerabilities have been patched if they include those in there.
I actually trust the developers that include the vulnerability patches more than the ones that don't.
Definitely. They're transparent and open, and they're trying to hide anything, and they're being very open and letting you know that, hey, we made a mistake, but we fixed it. So can you earn that trust from us, basically? Yeah.
You can compare that with like WP vulnerability, so you can compare how many vulnerabilities have actually been found in a plugin with, how many were found in their actual changelog, to get an idea of how transparent they're being.
Yeah.
And
that brings us to the next tool, is WP vulnerability. Do you want to tell us a little bit more about that, Ram?
Sure. WP vulnerability is basically the WordPress vulnerability database. It keeps track of, or at least tries to keep track of, every vulnerability in every WordPress or every plugin and theme in the WordPress ecosystem, as well as any WordPress core vulnerabilities. I'm not as familiar with the details on who runs it, but it is considered a very trustworthy source. So.
Yeah, we always submit those right after we release our blog post discovering vulnerabilities. We always submit it to the database, so they have that. And I know pretty much all the security researchers out there submit it there. So almost all the vulnerabilities.
If we don't submit it, they will pick up on the fact that we've released a vulnerability within the hour. So they are paying attention.
Yeah, which is great.
So yeah.
And so one last tool that we have to recommend is CodeRisk. It's RIP's CodeRisk. It's not like an end-all be-all solution, but it gives you a kind of good idea about if there's any code risks inside of a plugin. So if you just kind of check on the plugin there, if it's 100, there might be some problems in there. If it's 0, there might not be any problems in there. I wouldn't consider it an end-all be-all solution to tell you if a plugin is secure or not, because it's not. Automated solutions aren't perfect. It's better to have someone with the experience and stuff look at it directly, but it gives you a really good general idea of if a plugin's going to have any risks in their code, I guess I could say.
Go ahead, Ram.
No, I was just going to say, and I mean, like, there's also just best practices you can follow even without using tools. Like, if you're not using a plugin, delete it. And I mean, actually delete it, don't just deactivate it. Because even deactivated plugins, like if File Manager was deactivated but not deleted on your site, you still could have gotten infected because the vulnerability didn't even hook into WordPress core in any way. So also optimize your firewall if you haven't optimized it, because that's how we keep you protected from vulnerabilities that don't hook into WordPress core. That's the reason that functionality exists. It's so that we can protect you even for plugins that are vulnerable if they're not deleted but deactivated. And keep your plugins up to date. Depending on your use case, maybe set that to automatically update, and sign up for the Wordfence mailing list, because we will tell you when we find vulnerabilities. And even if you're not running Wordfence Premium, if you update that plugin or delete it as soon as you find out there's a vulnerability, that'll definitely help prevent you from getting attacked, or at the very least prevent any attacks from being successful.
Yeah, that's a lot of good information, with plugins. But what it all boils down to is similar to what we've talked about recently. Keep it up to date, and remove it if you don't need it. And with regard to what we had just talked about, take a look at the WordPress.org area and search your plugins and look and see what the support's like, and how frequently something's being updated. And that's a very good place to start. And you can go from there and use that same thing for each of your sites, each of your plugins, if you're going through and sort of doing an audit. And there's a lot of good resources out there, and we just talked about some of those. Anything to add, Ram or Chloe, before we wrap it up here?
Just that plugin selection matters.
Yeah.
Don't just pick
Keep
the first thing you
updating.
see.
Yep. There are a lot of options. There's over 9,000 plugins, as Ram mentioned earlier. Closer to about 60,000, but over 9,000.
Yeah, it's really easy to install them too. Like it can be so mindless. You can just say, "Oh, I need this. I'm just going to install it." Like one and done, real quick. But it's really important that you're taking those steps to make sure that it's something that you want installed on your site, and isn't going to cause any harm to your site.
Yeah.
All right. Well, we appreciate it, everybody stopping by, hanging out with us. If you found this helpful, hit the like button underneath the video here on YouTube. We'll continue doing this sort of content going forward. We got new live events coming out often. We do this every Tuesday at noon Eastern time, 9 a.m. Pacific. So if you're interested, you can click the bell and subscribe, and you'll be notified when we go live. We don't post a bunch of things here on YouTube. We'll put some walkthrough videos for different features and similar content out, but it's not constant, so you will not be overwhelmed with notifications there. Other than that, like I said, we go live every Tuesday. We've mentioned it multiple times, the mailing list. It's going to help keep you protected. Knowing about these issues as they're just coming out is a very important thing, and it can help you, especially if you're a free user. You might need to remove a plugin or get it updated, to keep yourself safe. As a premium user, it's always good to know what is going on your site, if it's a plugin that you have, and what to look out for. So we mail on just a few things. Again, with regard to alert fatigue, it's not something we mail out a bunch. We're mailing out for new blog posts and anything that's very important like that. So a lot of good information on the mailing list. We talked about some premium features earlier, the real-time IP blacklist. Somebody had asked about blocking countries with Wordfence Premium, and you can do that from the firewall blocking area, and you'll see 3 options down there, and country blocking is in the middle, and you'll have 2 options to select between the login form and the entire site, and that's where you can block from the login form, and you can pick the countries there. So if you want to support Wordfence, as I mentioned, like the video, subscribe, or you can get a Wordfence premium license to get access to those features that I had mentioned, and that's $99 for a year. If you have a staging site, you can write in, and we'll add that to your protection if it's not following conventional naming standards such as staging or test or similar. We'll be happy to help you out with that. A couple other tools and things to mention. We have a tool called Fast or Slow. It is a global performance monitoring solution for your websites, and it'll detect and report on the most important things and factors in your user's experience on your website. So if you have a site right now that's live and ready to go, you can head over to fastorslow.com and put the URL in there, and it'll give you a good outline of what the speed's like on your site, and you can sign up to monitor the site as well. And that's something new, and we're adding to that constantly. So definitely check it out and see how your site rates. Also, open.film. It's a film about the WordPress community, and I talk about this often. We haven't been able to go to the WordCamps lately, so if you've never been to a WordCamp, or you have and you're missing them, head over to open.film, and you can check out our short film that we made there. And I believe it's about 13 minutes long. Awesome film, and it really captures the atmosphere and how great people are in the WordPress community. So check that out. We also have a podcast that I host weekly, and it's produced by our awesome team here at Wordfence. It's called Think Like a Hacker. We post about that weekly on our blog, and you can find that down at the bottom of our wordfence.com homepage. Near the mailing list, you'll see podcast, and you can also see that on Spotify as well. and usually a 5 or 10 minute summary of the news for the week. So if you have 5 or 10 minutes to spare and you want to keep up with the security going on the web around you, definitely check that out. If you have any feedback for Wordfence Live or anything you'd like us to cover, any questions for us, write in at feedback@wordfence.com. Use Wordfence Live in the subject line, and we'll get back to you as quickly as we can. Chloe, Ram, anything before we clock out here?
Just that it's always a pleasure.
Yeah. Thanks for being here, everyone.
We appreciate it, everybody. Thanks for coming, and we'll see you next week. And until then, stay safe and have a good rest of the week. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.